How many are still breathing? The hidden cottonwood door swung open against the howling blizzard. Warm air slipped out. Inside the cave, dry firewood stood stacked high. A stone bench held the day's heat. Morrow, the old mule, breathed from a side chamber, and Ashpin, the gray cat, lay near the coals. Seraphine Vare asked it before Hollis Crane, a horse handler who had once laughed at her warning, could beg, before any apology could reach his mouth, because the storm behind him had already answered enough questions for one night. February of 1879 had turned the Montana Territory into a white grave. The blizzard erased the road to Ash Hollow Crossing, buried the fences, and drove snow sideways across the flats until men could no longer tell sky from ground. Hollis had followed the last thin ribbon of smoke to a gray limestone cliff, dragging what was left of the town behind him. A child hung silent in his mother's arms. Two old women lay wrapped on a broken barn door used as a sled. The strongest men could barely stand. Seraphine looked past Hollis. Not at his shame, not at his fear. She counted the people who still had a chance to live. 3 months earlier, on October 6, 1878, Seraphine Vare walked into Gideon Rusk's general store with frozen mud still clinging to her boots. She did not speak of luck or visions. She spoke of signs. The cranes had crossed the valley 3 weeks early. Mule deer had already drifted downhill. Snowshoe hares were turning white before the leaves had finished falling. Field mice were digging deeper nests. Thin ice had covered the water bucket outside her cabin before sunrise for 4 mornings in a row. She urged the town to stack dry firewood, bury root vegetables, seal every cabin, strengthen the livestock sheds, and move weaker animals behind windbreaks. Silence filled the store. Then someone laughed. Another joined in. Seraphine rested one hand on Gideon's counter. "Then measure the mornings," she said quietly. "Don't measure me." By evening, the argument had spread from Gideon Rusk's store to the church steps and the town council. Gideon warned that preparing for a winter no one could prove would cost the last profitable freight to Fort Benton. Calder Pike, the town's oldest carpenter, insisted that limestone caves trapped damp air, smoke, and death. Bram Vale, a young ranch hand who never lacked confidence, laughed the loudest. "Since when do we let wild beasts dictate how we run this town?" Reverend Asa Brindle raised one hand for silence. "We must not stir panic over uncertain signs." Seraphine never argued. She asked for 3 simple tests. Board the north side of every livestock shed. Separate dry firewood from green wood. Hang a mercury thermometer outside every cabin until sunrise. No one agreed. Doing those things would look too much like admitting she might be right. Only Mara Bellwether, a young widow raising 2 children alone, hesitated near the back of the room, then lowered her eyes. Silence was safer than taking the side of a 17-year-old girl. The town's pride did not shake Seraphine. While the people of Ash Hollow chose to blind themselves to nature, she had long been forged by a man who trusted only the honesty of stone and wind. Seraphine's father, Ivor Vare, had trapped beaver through the Gallatin country and worked as a stonemason whenever mining camps needed skilled hands. He never taught his daughter to trust instinct alone. 1 sign warns. 3 signs instruct. He compared animals with water, wind, and rock before reaching any conclusion. He taught her how to read cracks in limestone, how to tap stone and hear hidden space behind it, how to test a smoke draft with a small fire, and how dry grass revealed invisible air currents. "A shelter doesn't defeat winter," he often said. "It only makes winter take longer to get inside." A rock slide killed him when Seraphine was 14. She kept only his worn, cold chisel, a hand auger, an old trapping knife, and a 12-foot measuring cord. After Ivor's death, Seraphine lived alone in a weathered lean-to beyond the edge of Ash Hollow Crossing. She patched coats, repaired leaking roofs, cared for livestock, and kept company with the only creatures that never judged her, an old mule named Morrow and a gray cat called Ashpin. She traded long days of work for flour, salt, or lamp oil. People welcomed her hands. They never welcomed her place at the table. She had warned Mara Bellwether about a late frost, saving a coop full of young chickens. Calder Pike ignored the same warning, and lost an entire patch of beans. She predicted the eastern creek would flood after hail struck the mountains, but Bram Vale drove a colt across anyway and never brought it home. Each time she proved right, the town grew less comfortable. Being wrong hurt. Being wrong because a 17-year-old girl had been right hurt even more. Mara quietly slipped an extra pinch of salt into Seraphine's pay sack. She never thanked her out loud. But the quiet pity of one person could not soothe the ego of a crowd. Ash Hollow chose the cruelest path, erasing the one who spoke the truth. On October 9, 1878, the town reached its decision without ever calling it an exile. They called it cooling, the town's fear. The gentle words made the act even colder. Seraphine was allowed one small sack of cornmeal. Outside her lean-to, Mara Bellwether quietly left an old buffalo robe before dawn, making sure no one saw her. Seraphine packed her father's trapping knife, the worn cold chisel, the small hand auger, the 12-foot measuring cord, and a pouch of salt. Mara waited without complaint. As she tied the last bundle, Ashpin leaped onto it and curled into the blanket as if the choice had already been made. Bram laughed. Looks like even her cat believes her stories. Gideon lowered his eyes. Reverend Asa Brindle offered a short prayer for the peace of Ash Hollow Crossing. He never mentioned the girl leaving it behind. Seraphine turned north. She never looked back. Behind her, Ashpin let out one quiet cry. It was the closest thing to a farewell anyone gave her. Her back to the wooden cabins, her face to the blizzard, Seraphine walked into the wild. She did not seek mercy, for she knew that now, the cold cliffs were the only things left that could not lie. The first cave was too low. Fresh coyote droppings covered the entrance, and the smell of a recent den lingered inside. Seraphine moved on. The second looked safer until water dripped steadily from the ceiling. Every stone felt damp beneath her hand. Ashpin stopped at the entrance, arched its back, and refused to take another step. The third opening was wide enough, but a strong draft blew through it. Her oil lamp went dark within seconds. Mara slipped on the frozen rock while climbing out, reminding her that even the strongest companion had limits. By the third day, she found a gray limestone seam beneath a cliff nearly 52 feet high. The ridge rose along the northeast edge of Ash Hollow Crossing, less than 3/4 of a mile from town, close enough to reach on foot in good weather, yet hidden from the settlement by broken rock and scattered pines. Below it lay a narrow draw, where a spring still whispered beneath thin sheets of ice. The opening measured barely 26 inches across and led into a cramped hollow. It was far from perfect. It was simply possible. Seraphine tapped the limestone with her father's cold chisel. The hollow echo answered from somewhere beyond the rock. She rested one hand against the cliff and looked at Morrow. This one may listen. Seraphine began exactly as her father had taught her. Never force the mountain. Persuade it. She drove dry willow wedges into natural cracks. Water from the spring soaked the wood until it swelled against the stone. Then came the worn cold chisel. A careful strike. Another. Never too many. Never too hard. At night, she built a small fire against the limestone, warming only one section at a time. Before dawn, she splashed cold spring water across the heated rock. The sharp change in temperature opened new fractures without bringing the ceiling down. Progress came in inches. Each evening, she stretched her father's 12-foot measuring cord across the chamber and marked fresh lines with charcoal. Slowly, the hollow grew toward 13 feet deep, 9 feet wide, and 6.5 feet high. Her hands blistered. The blisters burst. Then they hardened into thick calluses. Morrow dragged broken limestone outside in rough willow baskets, one slow load after another. Around the entrance, Ashpin hunted wild field mice hiding in the rock, pausing in wary stillness whenever a bitter draft slipped through the unsealed cracks. Deep inside, Seraphine raised an 18-inch limestone bench to absorb the heat. When the hollow was finally shaped, she lit the first flame to test the air draft, but the first test of survival failed. Smoke rolled across the ceiling, then dropped until it filled the chamber. Her eyes burned. Her lungs seized. She dropped to her hands and knees, coughing hard enough to taste ash, and crawled into the freezing air outside. For several long minutes, she lay on the thin snow, breathing in the bitter wind until her chest loosened. Calder Pike had been right about one thing. A cave could become a trap if the smoke had nowhere to go. When the coughing finally stopped, Seraphine wiped her eyes with the back of one cracked hand. The mountain had not beaten her. It had corrected her. She picked up the cold chisel, stepped back into the cave while her eyes were still red, and began looking for the mistake. The next morning, Seraphine stopped digging. The cave no longer needed strength. It needed answers. She solved the smoke first. Using the highest natural crack, she carved a narrow draft slot no wider than 4 inches. She lowered the fire pit and set a flat limestone slab above it, creating a rough smoke shelf that guided hot air toward the opening instead of letting it spread across the ceiling. The second problem was water. A slow trickle still seeped through the back wall. She cut a shallow channel across the floor, lined it with flat stones, and carried the water toward a small sump near the entrance, leaving the sleeping area dry. The third problem revealed itself without a sound. Ashpin kept curling beside the door, then pawing at the same corner before walking away. Seraphine scattered dry grass along the threshold. The blades trembled. Cold air was slipping through a gap no wider than a finger. She removed the cottonwood door, trimmed it again, packed the edges with a clay and ash mixture, added stronger deer hide hinges, and hung Mara's old buffalo robe across the inside as another barrier. When she finished, she tied a single thread beside the doorway. The north wind returned. The thread no longer snapped wildly. It only quivered. Morrow stood quietly inside. The smoke climbed. The bedding stayed dry. That night, Ashpin fell asleep beside the door without lifting its head once. For the first time, Seraphine believed the cave might survive more than a single night. It might survive an entire winter. The final days of October quietly slipped away across the valley. Seraphine stopped building a shelter. She started building a way to survive. Every piece of firewood earned a purpose. Dry pine kindling became quick flame. Dense maple and oak became coal wood for long, steady heat. Green cottonwood was stacked apart as a wet reserve, left for emergencies after months of drying. Rabbit snares appeared along narrow game trails. Thin strips of meat smoked slowly beneath a limestone shelf. Cattail roots dried beside clusters of rose hips. Wild turnips and bitterroot filled a storage pit dug below the frost line. A small side chamber, barely 5 by 7 feet, became her pantry. Meat hung from wooden poles high enough to keep it beyond the reach of mice. Morrow hauled dead cottonwood logs from the valley, one slow trip at a time, never hurrying, never stopping. Ashpin earned every meal. The gray cat silently patrolled the pantry each night. Thanks to its vigilance, mouse tracks grew scarce, and the food sacks remained unchewed by morning. Then Seraphine began recording numbers instead of hopes. She carved them into a flat piece of wood. Outside before sunrise, 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, 3 hours after the fire died, 39 degrees Fahrenheit. She placed a tin cup on the limestone bench. By morning, the frost had melted around its base. The stone had held enough warmth to outlast the flames. That mattered more than any opinion spoken back in Ash Hollow. Nature would accept measurements long before it accepted confidence. When supper came, Seraphine cut the best piece of rabbit in 2. The larger share went to Morrow with a bundle of sweeter hay. Ashpin licked warm fat from her fingertips before curling beside the pantry door. In the quiet cave, not a single sound was made. Between her and the animals, understanding had surpassed the need for words. The first snow arrived on November 3, 1878. It was not the soft kind children remembered. Heavy flakes soaked everything they touched. By nightfall, they hardened into ice. Across Ash Hollow Crossing, barn roofs sagged beneath the weight. Firewood left uncovered disappeared beneath frozen crusts. Horses and cattle turned their backs to the north wind, long before their owners understood why. From the narrow entrance of her L-shaped cave, Seraphine watched the storm through the opening without a word. Ashpin refused to step outside. Morrow quietly turned away from the entrance, facing the warm stone instead of the wind, following an instinct older than memory. Back in town, Mara Bellwether stared at the pile of wet firewood behind her house. She remembered every warning. Gideon Rusk opened his ledger again, calculating how many weeks the food might last. For the first time, the numbers offered less comfort than they once had. Calder Pike noticed smoke from several cabins blowing downward, instead of rising cleanly into the sky. Seraphine saw none of it. She only watched the falling snow. She did not see victory. She saw that every day the town had wasted was now buried beneath the storm. November faded into December, yet Ash Hollow Crossing still called the early snow a passing season instead of a warning. Gideon urged everyone to ration supplies, but he counted every family separately instead of treating the town as one. The ledger balanced, the people did not. Bram Vale led a hunting party along the same trails he had trusted for years. They returned with empty sleds. The mule deer had already moved into lower valleys weeks earlier, exactly as Seraphine had predicted. Calder Pike worked from dawn until dark, patching livestock sheds after the strongest winds had already arrived. The shrinking boards only widened the cracks he tried to seal. Cold always found another opening. One family burned broken chairs. Another fed fence rails into the stove. Soon barrels, wagon boards, and old tool handles disappeared into the fire. The weakest cattle died first. Not all at once. One here, another there. Each morning, someone counted one less living animal than the day before. Inside her small cabin, Mara nailed an old blanket across the north-facing door exactly as Seraphine had once shown her. The draft nearly vanished. Silas and his little sister slept through the night without coughing. Mara rested her hand against her son's warm forehead before sunrise. Outside, no one wanted to speak Seraphine's name. Inside, her quiet lesson was already keeping two children alive. Early January of 1879 brought the storm Seraphine had been preparing for. It arrived without mercy. By sunrise, the thermometer outside her cave read -38 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind slammed across Ash Hollow Crossing in gusts that reached nearly 62 miles an hour. Snow no longer drifted downward. It flew sideways. White filled the air until earth and sky became the same color. The north livestock shed collapsed before noon. Two men walked less than 200 yards from their cabin to gather firewood. Neither found the woodpile again. While the world howled, Seraphine reached for her own records instead of her fears. The distance between life and death was proven in numbers. Despite the deadly freeze outside, her shelter maintained 43 degrees Fahrenheit, with only a low fire. 9 hours after the last bright flames disappeared, the limestone bench still carried enough warmth to soften the ice around a tin cup. She hung a single thread beside the doorway. The wind roared against the cottonwood board, yet the thread barely trembled. The seal held. Morrow stood quietly in the side chamber, chewing hay without shivering. Ashpin slept beside the glowing coals, opening its eyes only when a violent gust struck the cliff before curling back into the warmth. The cave had not defeated winter. No shelter ever could. It had simply forced the cold to fight for every inch instead of giving it the whole room at once. Out in the valley, the storm judged every roof, every woodpile, every forgotten crack. But here, the mountain answered with absolute silence. And for the first time since leaving Ash Hollow, Seraphine allowed herself to believe that her father's lesson had survived with her. Winter was never beaten by pride, only by preparation. The fire in Mara Bellwether's cabin had burned down to a bed of weak coals. Because it was one of the few places left in town that still held a trace of warmth, Gideon Rusk, Calder Pike, Hollis Crane, and several other men had gathered here, huddled around the dying hearth. In the corner of the room, Mara's two children slept beneath patched quilts, their breathing shallow but steady. Within that cramped, gloomy space, the adults argued in tired voices. How much flour remained? How many beans? How many people could survive another week? The answers grew smaller every time someone counted. Silas Bellwether, Mara's 10-year-old son, finally broke the silence. Seraphine said there was a valley where the cliffs blocked the wind, he whispered from beneath his blanket. She said stone stayed warm longer than wood. No one answered. Bram Vale shook his head. If she were alive, she'd have come back. Hollis said nothing. He remembered the snowshoe hares turning white before autumn had ended. He remembered the cranes leaving early. He remembered laughing with everyone else. The room seemed colder than before. Not because the fire was dying, because certainty was. At last, Hollis stood. "If she is dead," he said quietly, "we owe her a grave." He looked around the room before finishing. "If she is alive, we owe her far more than that." No one argued. Mara walked to a wooden chest and lifted out the only buffalo robe she had kept. It matched the one she had secretly left outside Seraphine's door months before. Without a word, she placed it into Hollis's hands, like a long overdue apology. 5 people left Ash Hollow Crossing before dawn. Hollis carried the lantern. Calder carried the rope. The others shared a small sack of flour, a blanket, and a rough map drawn from memory. Bram Vale walked in front. "We'll save half a day cutting through the western gulch," he said. "I know these hills better than a girl who lives with a mule and a cat." No one answered. Within an hour, the shortcut became a trap. The wind poured through the narrow gulch like water through a funnel. Snow buried the edges of the rocks until the trail disappeared beneath a single sheet of white. One man stepped forward and vanished, waist deep into a hidden wash, twisting his ankle as the others pulled him free. Minutes later, their own footprints were gone. The storm erased them as quickly as they had been made. Even Calder, who could measure a roof by sight, no longer knew which direction led home. Hollis stopped. Then he remembered. Seraphine had once pointed toward a lone cottonwood bent permanently away from the north wind. Beyond it, she had described a limestone cliff whose jagged rim looked like broken teeth against the sky. He turned without asking permission. "We follow her landmarks." Bram protested for only a moment. Then he saw there was nothing left to defend. Near sunset, the storm finally loosened its grip. Far ahead, against the gray cliff, a thin ribbon of smoke climbed almost perfectly straight into the frozen air. For the first time in months, Bram said nothing. He simply kept walking toward the smoke. The narrow ribbon of smoke led them to the base of the limestone cliff. Then it disappeared. For several anxious minutes, the search party walked past Solid Rock, convinced they had lost the trail again. "The smoke came from here," Bram muttered. "There isn't a cave." "There is," Hollis replied. "We're just looking at the wrong wall." Hidden behind a bend in the cliff, the L-shaped entrance lay buried beneath wind-packed snow and scattered stone. Before anyone reached it, Ashbin was already awake. The gray cat sprang onto the warm limestone bench, ears forward, tail stiff. In the side chamber, Morrow lifted his head and struck one hoof against the floor. A heartbeat later, the heavy cottonwood door opened. Seraphine stood in the entrance. She looked thinner than when she had left Ash Hollow. The winter wind had darkened her face, and old cracks marked both hands, but she stood straight. Her eyes were clear. She looked tired, not defeated. The men stepped inside one by one. No one spoke. Smooth limestone walls reflected the firelight. Dry firewood stood stacked in careful rows, sorted by size and purpose. Smoked rabbit and venison hung safely above the floor. A narrow stone-lined channel carried dripping water toward a small sump near the entrance. Above the fire, a blackened smoke shelf guided every trace of smoke into the hidden draft slot. Mara's old buffalo robe still covered the inside of the door. The cave was not comfortable. It was efficient. Calder looked up at the smoke vent. Months earlier, he had laughed at the thought of living inside limestone. Now the clean air around him quietly answered every argument he had made. No speech could have been stronger. No apology could have carried more weight. Seraphine never asked whether they regretted what they had done. She looked past them toward the white storm still raging outside. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "How many can still walk?" Hollis removed his gloves before speaking. "There are about 96 people left in Ash Hollow," he said. 14 have died since the first week of January. 5 never came back from hunting or gathering firewood. He lowered his head. But Mara's children are still alive. Seraphine closed her eyes for only a moment. Then Bram looked toward the pantry. "We need food." She glanced at the shelves. Smoked meat, roots, dried berries. Enough for one person. Perhaps 2, not a town. Food buys days, she said quietly. "Shelter buys lives." She spread her father's measuring cord across the stone bench and traced a line through the air with one finger. "My cave will take the children, the elderly, the sick, anyone too weak to survive another night." Then she pointed toward the eastern end of the limestone ridge. "There are smaller limestone pockets less than a mile from here. They aren't as warm as this one, but they'll work." She looked at each man in turn. "They'll need sealed entrances, raised stone benches, shared fires, smoke shelves, drainage channels. No one stays alone. No one chooses a place because it's closer. The first night must have order. If it doesn't," she looked toward the storm outside, "the cold will choose for us." Silence settled over the cave. Finally, Hollis asked the question no one else could. "After everything we did, why would you help us?" Seraphine reached for the worn measuring cord that had belonged to her father. She wrapped it slowly around her hand. "He taught me something," she said. "Winter never listens to apologies." She looked toward the doorway. "But people can still listen to instructions." No one spoke again. The rescue had already begun. 3 days later, the evacuation began. The storm showed no mercy. Neither could the plan. Nettie Crowell, the oldest widow in Ash Hollow, refused to leave her cabin. "I'll die where I belong," she whispered. Seraphine never argued. She lifted the hinges from the cabin door, lashed the heavy boards together with rope, and turned it into a sled. Morrow leaned into the harness without hesitation. Only after Nettie was wrapped beneath blankets did she climb aboard. The old woman kept her eyes lowered. Months earlier she had called Seraphine cursed. Now she could not bear to meet her gaze. Halfway to the ridge, one freight sled snapped an axle beneath the weight. Bram reached for the iron tools. "We leave the blankets," he said. "No," Seraphine answered. "The iron stays. The blankets, food, salt, knives, and children move." No one questioned her again. A little girl began losing feeling in both hands. Hidden beneath Mara's buffalo robe, Ashpin crawled onto the child's lap and curled tightly against her fingers, sharing what little warmth the small body could give. When the caravan finally reached the limestone cave, Seraphine opened the main shelter first. Mara and her 2 children entered. Nettie followed. Then came a man with blackened fingers from frostbite, an exhausted young mother, and 3 more children barely able to stand. To make room, Seraphine led Morrow into a sheltered alcove beside the cliff, protected with timber and a thick animal hide. The old mule settled there without resistance. Inside the cave, Ashpin stretched across the warm bedding among the children, as if it had always belonged there. Only after the weakest were safe did Seraphine divide everyone else into work crews. Hollis, Calder, Bram, and the strongest men followed her along the limestone ridge. They carried cottonwood poles, clay, ash, blankets, rope, and tools. No speeches were given. Bram spent the rest of the afternoon digging drainage channels exactly where Seraphine pointed. For the first time since meeting her, he learned with a shovel instead of an opinion. During the days that followed, Seraphine stopped thinking like one survivor. She began thinking like a system. Every cave had to work the same way. Every mistake had to disappear. She showed each crew how to seal entrances with a mixture of clay and wood ash. Buffalo robes were hung behind every door to create a second barrier against the wind. Fire pits stayed low so the limestone could absorb heat instead of wasting it in the air. Dry kindling, coal wood, and reserve wood were stacked separately. Smoke slots were cleared every morning. Bedding stayed away from damp walls. Drainage channels carried water outside. Smoked meat hung high above the floor. Children and the elderly always slept farthest from the entrance. Soon the lessons began teaching themselves. Calder Pike spent an entire afternoon carving smoke shelves with careful hands. When Gideon Rusk finally reached the ridge, he opened his ledger again. This time, it told a different story. Outside, -31 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the crowded shelters, 46 degrees Fahrenheit. The caves burned barely a third as much firewood as the cabins back in town had needed. Even the numbers had changed sides. Bram returned one evening carrying fresh elk meat after following the exact route Seraphine had marked between the ridges. She never stood above anyone giving orders. She moved from cave to cave instead, pressing fresh clay into tiny cracks, checking smoke drafts, tightening blankets, and fixing whatever the mountain exposed. Late that evening, Calder walked over without a word. He placed Ivor's worn cold chisel into Seraphine's hands. He offered no apology. He did not need one. Some truths were heavier, when carried in silence, than they could ever be in words. By the end of March, the blizzards finally began to loosen their grip on the valley. Not everyone lived to see the thaw. The first people to survive were the ones who had spent that terrible first night inside Seraphine's cave. Without its warm stone walls, the children, the elderly, and the weakest would never have seen another sunrise. The smaller caves saved the rest. When the counting was finally over, 79 people had survived within the limestone shelters. 14 had died before Hollis ever reached the ridge. 5 vanished into the storm and were never found. 2 more died during the evacuation because their bodies had already surrendered to the cold. Yet, 19 children under the age of 12 were still alive. Mara's son and daughter were among them. Reverend Asa Brindle lived long enough to watch families walk out of the caves alive. He never admitted in public that Seraphine had been right. Near the end of March, he died from pneumonia after giving his last blanket to an elderly man whose breathing had nearly stopped. Right and wrong had never been simple. Neither was mercy. When Seraphine heard the news, she lowered her eyes and gave a single nod. Nature had judged everyone alike. It had never cared who had spoken wisely, only who had prepared in time. Mara held both of her children close that evening. More than once, she looked toward Seraphine. More than once, she looked away again. Some kinds of gratitude arrived, carrying the weight of shame. By May of 1879, the snow had finally retreated from Ash Hollow Crossing. The survivors gathered outside beneath an open sky. No one suggested meeting inside the church. Closed rooms still carried memories of weak fires, smoke, and long nights waiting for morning. Hollis Crane stepped forward first. "We were never fooled by a 17-year-old girl," he said. "We were fooled by our own pride." No one argued. Gideon Rusk opened his ledger one last time. This time it recorded no debts, no freight, and no profit. It listed temperatures inside the limestone shelters. Firewood consumed, days survived, lives saved. For the first time, the ledger was no longer keeping score against nature. It was learning from it. Calder Pike spoke only once. "The caves didn't almost kill us. Our delay did." Right then, at the gathering, when the town finally turned to Seraphine and asked her to speak, she said very little. "My father taught me something long before he taught me how to shape stone." She looked across the people gathered before her. "The cold does not care who was right. It only finds what was left undone." She paused. "If you want to learn, I'll teach you. Not because I need to be remembered, but because children should never have to wait for one cave to hold the last fire." The lesson stayed, proven in actions rather than words. Bram Vale offered no speech that day. Instead, he spent the following days building raised firewood racks along the north edge of town, exactly as Seraphine had once advised. Nobody laughed at the design anymore. One afternoon, Nettie Crowell walked slowly to the cave carrying a pair of rough wool mittens she had stitched herself. The seams wandered. The fingers were uneven, but they were warm. She left them outside the door and quietly walked away. By that autumn, Ash Hollow built stone winter stores instead of relying on thin wooden sheds. Firewood was stacked under permanent roofs and sorted before the first frost. Root cellars were dug below the frost line. Wind flags rose at 3 entrances to the settlement. Children learned to read animal trails with the same patience they learned their letters. Seraphine never moved back into town. She remained beside the limestone ridge, quietly enlarging her shelter with 2 additional chambers, capable of protecting 24 people whenever another hard winter came. Years later, Morrow died beneath the same bent cottonwood that had once guided Hollis through the storm. The old mule was buried there, facing the valley he had crossed so many times. Ashpin lived long enough to become a favorite story among the town's children. They said the gray cat could hear the wind before the grown men did. When Seraphine grew older, She passed Ivor's worn measuring cord to her first student. Nothing else could have honored him better. The only words she ever carved into the limestone above the cave entrance were not a celebration. They were a reminder. The mountain did not warn twice. I did.